I apologize in advance for all the times that I try to gesticulate with my two hands and you can't hear me because of it. Do we have a clicker? That somewhere. I'll get started. So I'm an elder here at ECB, and well, can't do this without the clicker. As the father of this adorable little one, my daughter Grace, I've learned a lot about limits in the past couple months, my own and kind of all of ours as little tiny humans. And I don't know if that has anything to do with why I got asked to talk. It's the second in our series on receiving the gifts of limits. Okay, we might have to do a thing. But here we are. Anyway, if you don't mind, I'd like to pray real quickly before we end. Wonderful God, I ask that you would send your word and your spirit into this place. That you would fill it with your peace. That you would fill it with wisdom. That you would be there in the interaction between the words spoken, the words heard. Bless this community, receive our thoughts and our words, Lord. Our songs and our prayers. Receive them as worship this afternoon. In the name of Jesus. Amen. So, I'd like to start with a rather odd story that you can find in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. It goes like this. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heaven. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people. They have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. What's going on here? What is this story about? It seems odd. It seems maybe it's an explanation for why there are so many languages in the world. Maybe it's an account of how the city of Babylon got its name. There's a pun there in the Hebrew. But I think there's something more important than those sort of origin stories happening here. Something that, as you might have guessed, if you were here last week or saw the open slide, has to do with limits. And it's not simply, there's a limit on how tall you can build your tower before God does something about it. Matt talked last week about how the limits that God gives us as individuals are a gift. They make us individuals, and they call us to an eternal responsibility, he said, to live precisely as the individuals that we're made to be. But we're tempted to reject those limits by envying other people, or like Adam and Eve in the story of Genesis 3, by seeking to become like God in a way that's just not possible for human beings. I think there's something similar that's true for our human communities. And I think the story of the Tower of Babel can tell us something about that. But to see how, we have to back up a little bit. We can't just jump in at the beginning of that story. Because immediately before the story of the Tower of Babel, there's this passage, this is the famous story of the flood. God instructs the man Noah to build an ark in which to save his family, and 2 of every species of animal on the earth, from this devastating flood that's over the entire earth. Now, after the flood, God blesses Noah and promises never to send another flood. It says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will require a reckoning. For every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning of human life." And then God says, why? Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And then suddenly again, we're back to, and you, be fruitful and multiply. Abound on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth that is with you, as many as came out of the ark." And then God goes on to commit to not sending another flood. There's this covenant, this relationship, this promise of God that's given to Noah and to all of Noah's descendants. Now, 2 things in this passage will help us read the Tower of Babel story. First, notice that God commands Noah and his family twice to multiply and fill up the now empty earth. Right? There's been this flood, it's kind of wiped everything out, and God's command is go, spread out, fill the earth. That's my vision for it. Second, notice that God covenants not just with Noah, but with all of Noah's descendants, and not to mention every living creature. And since as far as the text is concerned, the only humans that there are either Noah or descendants of Noah, that means everybody's included, right? The text vision is for the inclusion of all of humanity in this covenant with God. Maybe to emphasize this kind of everyone included aspect, shortly after the blessing passage, we get this really long list. Well, actually, for the book of Genesis, it's not super long, but there's a really long list of all the different nations that are descended from Noah's sons. Here it is, with most of the names taken out, both for the sake of brevity and because I don't want to have to say them. My Hebrew pronunciation is awful. So, it goes like this. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Children were born from them after the flood. The descendants of Japheth, and you get the descendants of his descendants, the descendants of Gomer and Javan. And from these, the coastland people spread back. These are the descendants of Japheth, with their lands, with their own language, by their families, in their nations. Then we get the descendants of Ham, the descendants of Ham's descendants, one of whom is Canaan, who becomes the father of them, etc., right? Afterwards, the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. These are the descendants of Ham, by their families, their languages, their lands, their nation. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth's children were born. And you get Shem's descendants. These are the descendants of Shem by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. These, altogether, are the families of Noah's sons, according to their genealogies, in their nations, and from those nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. So we have all these different people, all descendants of Noah, and so all blessed by the promise of God. These different nations, these different families, all with their different lands, all with their different languages. And that brings us back to the Tower of Babel story, which starts in the next verse. And it goes, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words." What gives, right? You just told me this long list of people, and they had their own languages, with their languages, it says. Something's amiss, right? Let's keep looking to see if we can figure out what's going on here. So, the rest of the passage goes there. I've already read this once, it'll get familiar. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and they migrated from the east. They came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So it looks like we just kind of haven't gotten to the point where all those distinctions between nations have happened. It seems like everybody's kind of wandering from the east out to the west, and they find a great place and they say, "Look, this is where we're going to set down roots, we're going to stay together, we're going to get famous, we're going to do something really, really impressive. We'll get a reputation for being really, really powerful, and nobody will try to scatter us," because that's the good thing, right? Stay together. But the list of nations at the end of the story of the flood shows that the vision of God for humanity, right? Multiply and fill the earth, is precisely to spread out. To do it as different communities, this whole long list of nations that come from Noah's sons. So by building one city and one tower to the heavens, the people are quite simply resisting God's vision for humanity. In the abstract, that might be a fine idea. But God has said, "Go, scatter, fill the earth." That same word that's translated here, scattered, shows up in the passage about the sons of Noah and their descendants as the sons of Canaan spreading abroad. So, in the rest of the story, when we get back to the Tower of Babel story here, God just starts to accomplish God's vision for humanity, regardless of the human resistance. And so the diversity the diversity of human communities that should have been a blessing, that was God's charge, is experienced by the people at Babel as a punishment. It says, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, 'Look, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord scattered them abroad from there, over the face of all their earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth." I said at the beginning that I thought the story of Babel could help us to understand something at the level of human communities that's analogous, similar to what Matt was talking about last week at the level of human individuals. And specifically, I think there are two lessons that we can learn here that I'd like to share today. First, every community that we're a part of is limited and has a limited call. Just like each one of us is limited and has a limited call, a limited identity that we're meant to live into, so the same communities. And second, human communities, I tried to find I'm going to sound like a theologian here, that's my kind of day job. Human communities as such have a fundamental limit. I don't know if normal people talk like that. I tried to think, what can I say other than as such? Per se. Human communities, qua human communities. It didn't work. If you have suggestions, come tell me, because I've forgotten how to say this in normal English. So, let's take these two lessons in turn. So first, every community that we're part of is limited and has a limited call. Recall that God desires for humanity after the flood, God's desire for humanity is to spread out, to scatter across the earth as different peoples. Now, when we're dealing with finite things, like, say, humans and their communities, the difference, that diversity of peoples, depends at least in part on limits. For me to be distinct from you, there has to be some limit to you. If you were, say, all-encompassing, right? I might be a part of you, but I wouldn't be distinct from you. So when the humans all get together to build one city in one tower, when they reject the diversity of communities that God desires, what they're doing, at least in part, is rejecting the limits that are necessary for God's vision for humanity to be fulfilled. But what does that have to do with us? We live in a world where it's obvious, sometimes painfully obvious, that there are different communities and that they all have limits. But I think we have to ask ourselves a question. Do we really want our communities to be limited? Wouldn't the world be better if everyone joined our sorts of communities, right? If everyone were, say, Democrats, or, depending on your preference, Republicans, or if everyone were college educated, or if everyone were same sort of Christian as me, wouldn't it be easier and better? Now, I know we all know that you're supposed to say no to that, right? There's nobody out here who said, yes, everybody should be exactly like me. I know I'm supposed to say that's the answer. But if I'm honest with myself, I kind of want to answer yes to some of those questions. At least some part of me operates that way. There's a warning here in the story of Babel. And it's that a warning against that temptation to want our communities to be unlimited. It's a warning against the subtle forms of imperialism that it's so easy for us to fall into. It's that imperialism of thinking that everything would be better if everyone were just, maybe just a bit more like us, more a part of our communities. Commenting on the story of Babel, the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann writes, humanity creates a self-made unity in which it has a fortress mentality. It seeks to survive by its own resources. It is a unity grounded in fear and characterized by coercion. A human unity without the vision of God's will is likely to be ordered into oppressive conformity. The narrative, that story of the Tower of Babel, is a protest against every effort at oneness derived from human self-sufficiency and autonomy. So far, I've been talking mainly about the sorts of things that limits on human communities can help us avoid, right? Help us avoid that urge to kind of extend ourselves, our sorts of communities, swallow others whole. But there's a positive side here, too. I mean, after all, these are God-given limits. They're gifts. They are part of God's vision for the flourishing of humanity. Again, I think there's an analogy with what Matt talked about last week. Somewhat like each person has a very particular responsibility as an individual before God. Each one of our human communities has particular responsibilities, a particular calling defined by its own particular limits. There are innumerable good goals out there. Innumerable. We can't imagine how many good, great things there would be to do, to seek, together as a community. But God called each community to the pursuit of just some of them. And that call is dynamic, so it means in different times and different places, one and the same community will have different good things that it's called to pursue. That's okay. That's how it's meant to be. That doesn't mean that the things the community isn't focusing on aren't good. And it doesn't mean that the people in that community shouldn't care about those other things. It simply means that God has gifted that community. Gifted it with limits that give it the freedom to emphasize some finite set of goods and goals. And that's great, because whatever else a community is, it's finite. And that's true even of the church. The elders team here at ECV recently went through a process of discernment that was in great part about finding out that a church is finite and that limits are a gift firsthand. I don't actually remember how it happened. It's funny how many big processes get started like that, right? You look back 6 months, 9 months down the line. No idea how the train got rolling in that direction. I don't remember. But somebody at some point got the idea that it would be helpful to articulate a vision for ECD for the next few years. We've long had core values and a mission that help orient our community. They often show up on slides here. But we thought it would be good to have something more time-bound, something to orient us more in the near term. So we started talking and praying and meeting and forming subcommittees that talked and prayed and met and so forth. But a lot of our talking fell flat, and a lot of our meetings felt fruitless. We came up with lists of things to include in the vision, and we came up with drafts of a statement of vision. But to me, at least, I can't speak for everybody, they seemed overwhelming and under-oriented. You looked at it, and you kind of shrank before the grandeur of the expansiveness of this vision. I couldn't look at them and feel confident and question, so what's the next step in that direction? I couldn't really look at them and say, that's a direction. So over time, it became clear to us that the vision we were seeking had to be specific enough to be limited. It had to kind of exclude some directions in order to point in a direction. And we began to ask God for something like that. Toward the end of the summer, there was this one meeting where part of the elders team met. We're tasked with sifting through all of this visioning process that we've been going through and settling on something that would help our community set priorities for the upcoming season. Now, going into that meeting was scary. When we were talking at the level of generalities, right, big abstractions, this expansive vision, when the scope was close to unlimited, I was really confident that we could all agree. It was easy. Nobody's going to say no to that. That's a good thing. But on specifics, when saying one thing means not saying another thing, what if we each said that we felt God was leading ECV towards something completely different? How would we handle that? It was a vulnerable meeting. The first few minutes were tense as we just all tried to figure out, is this going to be a vision, or are we going to have to look at the fact that we've got 6 or 7 visions in this room? As it turned out, the meeting was a testament to God's provision and guidance for this community. I was blown away, just floored by how much consensus there was in the room around a pretty concrete vision. Each one of us kind of in turn said, I've been thinking, I've been praying, this is what I've been feeling. And after not too long, something concrete took shape. Here's what we came up with in my words. We haven't formulated anything nearly so official as a vision statement. But we sensed, in the next 3 years, we sensed that God is calling us, this community, to cultivate specific, reproducible, transformative practices of discipleship here in our community. We sense that God is calling us to identify some some practices. That just means some activities that you might undertake regularly that we can learn and teach to others, perhaps, that would provide intentional spaces for God to work in and transform us as we seek to follow Jesus. Now, we don't know yet what those practices will be. But we can forge ahead knowing that what we're seeking to discern are specific practices that will contribute to our growth as disciples of Jesus. It's really helpful. It's amazing. We even have a sense that some of those practices will be practices of rest and intentional cross-cultural interaction. See, the specifics are starting to come. The limits are starting to come. Now, that process of discerning a limited vision for the next few years, and I can't emphasize enough, for the next few years, remember God's call is dynamic. It was a tough process. It was painful to face all of the things that weren't part of this vision for the next few years. It was hard not to pursue everything at once. But once we'd struggled through the process of discernment, once we'd landed on a vision that we were confident was what God is calling this community to in this season, it was liberating. God is giving ECD, I think, something wonderfully limited to walk into over the next few years. And we're free to pursue that vision, recognizing that it means not doing everything, but following God's call into some things. So, to sum up this first lesson, every community that we're a part of is limited, has a limited calling, because God's vision for humanity involves a diversity of communities, pursuing a diversity of God-given limited goods. Right? We don't have to pursue all of them, because we're not the only community out there. Presumably there are other communities with other calls that are also good. Now that I've said all of that, I need to make a few qualifications. There might be some of you sitting out there going, I'm not sure. I mean, after all, that's a lot of stress on very small, and a lot of stress on the diversity of communities. Now, first of all, as with the limits on human individuals, it's very important to distinguish between God-given limits to communities and sin-imposed limits on them. We're called to accept the former and resist the latter. So discerning which is a big deal, right? It seems to me that the sin-imposed limits come in at least two types. One, there are those things that our communities can't do because of our own sin. Lack of faith, or lack of courage, or sloth, or something of that sort, right? That's a sin-imposed limit, a limit imposed by our sinfulness. And two, there are those limits imposed on communities by injustice and oppression. I hope I don't have to tell you that history is just weighed down with examples of communities that have been unjustly limited. A good rule of thumb here might be, if one community is telling another what its proper place or its natural limits are, and then enforcing those limits, there's a really good chance sin is involved. Especially when those limits just happen to play out in favor of the community doing the enforcing. And at least a lot of us, well, in some sense all of us in this room are in certain communities that are more likely to be on the enforcing side than on the limited side. And a lot of us are also in communities that have been and continue to be limited. So we've got to watch out for this, and whatever you take away from this talk, don't say every limit on communities is good. Only those that come from God are. A second qualification to what I've just said about limits and diversity is that God's vision for humanity doesn't stop at the scattering. It involves diversity. It involves what in the Tower of Babel story is called scattering, all the way to the end. That never stops, but it also involves unity. The diversity of communities that God desires for humanity is diversity in unity. But crucially, God makes the unity of diverse communities. God binds human communities together in loving and worshiping and following God. The unity happens on God's terms, not on any of ours. Because, frankly, if we were in charge of unifying humanity, we would do it by oppression, by imperialism, by squelching difference, by all of those things that God is opposed to. I'm going to skip almost the entire Bible. We were just in Genesis. We're going to go to Revelation, which is way at the end. And in Revelation, we get an affirmation that the diversity of human communities doesn't disappear in the end. This is not a temporary thing like it would be if it were just some sort of punishment, right? It's one reason we can read the Tower of Babel story not as just a punishment, but as accomplishing the vision of God for humanity. John of Patmos describes one of the visions he receives from Jesus. He receives a lot of visions from Jesus. After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hand. But John also sees a powerful image of unity. These people from all the nations are gathered into a city that comes down from heaven to earth. In the end, we get one city, a unified humanity. But at its center is not a tower or a temple built by human hands, like in Babel. But we get instead the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, Jesus. They are it. It's not brick and mortar, but the river of the water of life and the tree of life. And the leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of nations. Nations are still there. They're still diverse. They're healed and brought together by God. Now, all the emphasis I've just been placing on God's acting in unifying human communities points towards the second lesson that I think we can learn about limits in community from the story of the Tower of Babel. And it's much easier to explain than the other one. It'll be quick. Human communities, as such, have a fundamental limit. It's significant, it's meaningful, that when the collected people of the earth are going across the plain, what they want to do is build a city with a tower to the heavens. We could interpret their action as an attempt to band together, to overcome createdness, and to just build their way up into the realm of God by human achievement. Right? We're just going to take the heavens. Interestingly, in verse 5 of the Babel story, we read this. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. You catch the past tense there at the end? Seems like the humans finished building a tower. And yet, try as they might, they couldn't get to God. The text still says that the Lord came down to see the tower, right? It's using that spatial imagery to say, you can't build it high enough. God still has to come down to see your attempt to get to the heavens. They can't transcend the fact that they're creatures. They can't storm heaven and become like God. Again, what does this have to do with us? Surely we're not all building towers to heaven. Although we have at least one architect in the room by training. No towers to heaven. Okay. But I think the basic temptation that's evident there in the Babel story, that's the temptation to strive for transcendence or salvation or our ultimate good as a community, to band together and do this, is still around. In fact, I think it's particularly strong temptation for many of us here today. I know it is for me. You see, we're clever enough to know that there's more to life than seeking our own individual good, our own individual achievement. And we certainly know that we can't save ourselves or the world by ourselves. So we go and we look for a cause, shaping culture or fighting injustice, ending poverty, or spreading the gospel. And we pour our hopes, our dreams, our identities, ourselves into the cause. And it doesn't seem like a rejection of limits. It seems like you're accepting it. I'm limited, so I have to join in. It doesn't seem like Adam. It doesn't seem like that kind of flagrant attempt to be like God. But sometimes, at least, it is. We replace the blatant individual attempt to overcome our createdness with a really nice, subtle, collective attempt to do it. All those things that I listed, they're good. By all means, go out there, shape culture, fight injustice, strive to end poverty, share the gospel. Those are great things to do. But we're tempted, when we're doing them, to seek our ultimate good, our salvation, in that, in something other than God, in something created. And that's just fundamentally misguided. No nation will save us, no research project will give us our ultimate good. No cause will save us, no matter how good. And no church will give us our ultimate good. This church will not give any of us our ultimate good. Human communities can build towers to the heavens all they want. But like the Tower of Babel, they'll never reach God. Our human communities might achieve all that they aim to do. I mean, let's pray to God that our human communities end extreme poverty. That'd be amazing. But even if they achieve that, they won't save us. They won't give us our ultimate good. That's the fundamental limit on all human communities. And that's good news. It's really good news. Because God has saved us. God will save us, and God is our ultimate good. It's good news. We're going to turn now to a time of response in communion and worship and prayer. And I invite you during that time to consider these questions. First, in what ways do the communities that you live in strive to live beyond their God-given limits? Your schools, your work, your church, have one. And two, in what ways do you encourage that rejection of limits? In what ways do you live into that? And how might you embrace those limits